Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to have another day with you. And today we're going to spend a lot of time on education finance. And we're probably going to spend a lot of time this year on education finance and every year thereafter. Big part of the committee's work. And we are fortunate to have the House Education Committee join us today for part of our overview, so that we can continue to collaborate on these issues. We have joint jurisdiction because essentially any spending decisions that are made in the House Education Committee then mean that property tax rates would likely have to shift over here in Ways and Means. So try to make those decisions together and collaborate. And really, does anyone have any announcements before we start? Okay. So Julia Richter from Joint Fiscal is going to join us and take us through their presentations on the House Ways and Means website under Julia's name for today. And we're all going to get an ed finance lesson. And then I believe on Friday, are you doing the workshop on Friday? Or are you next Friday's workshop?
Julia Richter, JFO. This Friday's workshop is not House Ed.
Okay.
Or not education, it's personal and corporate taxes. Okay. And I think I'm the next week, the week after.
But if anyone wants further refreshers after today, there are opportunities on our website and then next Friday as well. So
I just want to be clear, the documents for today for us to follow are on the Ways and Means website under Julia Richter.
On ours.
Oh, we have them on ours too. Thank you.
So they're joint, they're dual posted, which is great. Thank you. So Julia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. It's great to see you all in person, and hello to House Education.
Is this your first time here since the session started?
This is my first time testifying for this committee and House Ed for the session. So thank you. It's great to see you all. I have prepared the slide deck, Education Finance in Vermont, to serve as a primer. I know that we're all coming to it with very different levels of knowledge, background, expertise. So as I go through, feel free to interrupt me with questions or clarification. So if people have the PowerPoint in front of them, I'm just going to start going through. Just in terms of the outline, I'm on slide 2 here. We're really going to start with an overview, going over big picture education finance in the state of Vermont. Then we're going to go into education expenditures. And lastly, probably the bulk of our time will be spent on education funding, where we'll talk about the different property taxes, what they're looking at, as well as the property tax and income credits. So, on slide 3 now, just a brief introduction into Vermont's education finance system. So I think as we're all aware, education finance in Vermont is different from other states. It's a really unique formula because it's a statewide funding formula that's also coupled with local property tax administration. So school district spending is determined at the local level. This is where school boards set budgets that must be approved by voters, usually on town meeting day. And then the legislature, General Assembly, sets education yields and property tax rates annually at the level necessary to fund education expenditures. And I'll get into more detail in terms of the nuance of what the yields are, what the rates are. But usually those are set so that there's a balance in the education fund. There's 2 types of property taxes. There's the homestead property tax, and that includes the income sensitivity, the property tax adjustment. And there's also the non-homestead property tax. And the other sort of, I think, helpful context to have in mind is thinking about the Brigham decision in 1997. And since the Brigham decision, the homestead property tax rate is a function of district per pupil spending. So district rates are not a function of that district's property wealth, but rather they are a function of how much that district decides to spend per pupil in the district. So slide 4 provides a brief history of ed finance in Vermont. I won't necessarily go through each of these boxes unless it's helpful to folks, but I think it's really just helpful to keep in mind sort of where we were and where we are now. So prior to 1997, prior to the Brigham decision I was just talking about, Vermont relied on a foundation program to fund its education system, and this led to inequities in towns' tax rates and per pupil spending. So then there was the Brigham decision, and following that, there was the passage of Act 60. There's been passages of other prominent acts in the ed finance world, like Act 68. Last year, the passage of Act 127, the People Waiting Bill. But essentially now, a town's property wealth no longer affects its education tax rate. So does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, great. Then moving on to slide 5, Ed Finance Timeline. This is really sort of a snapshot of what does education finance look like in the state over a year. So on or before December 1st, the tax commissioner essentially recommends, is the term, the education tax rates for the next fiscal year. But this is really a ministerial task. There's a number of statutory requirements that the tax commissioner must follow in solving for the yields and tax rates in the December 1st letter. And this is a consensus letter, consensus education fund outlook with us at the Joint Fiscal Office. And I believe that later this morning, the tax commissioner will be coming in and the two of us will be going through the December 1st letter and the ed fund outlook in more detail. But it's important to keep in mind that while the December 1st letter is sort of this first starting point for ed fund discussions, it really is a starting point. It's a ministerial task, and ultimately it's up to the General Assembly and the governor to move forward in terms of figuring out the yields and the tax rates for that year. So after the December 1st letter, or during this time period, school boards and towns are preparing their school district budgets. The December 1st letter generally is used to sort of understand the status of the education fund by school districts. And then in March, usually during town meeting, voters approve their school district budgets. So over the course of the session, more information is coming in to us to figure out what's happening in the ed fund space. And so the legislature eventually will pass the yield bill, which we'll also be talking about this morning, which sets the state level base education property tax yield, the non-homestead property tax rate, and the income yield at the estimated level necessary to fund all education expenditures, all voter approved school budgets. Then after the passage of the yield bill on or before the 30th of June, the tax department will set those spending adjusted homestead tax rates, which will go into how they're adjusted. And then the towns will administer the education property tax and the taxpayers will pay the education taxes. And while all of this is happening, there's a few chunks of funds that are going out to school districts to fund their budgets. Big picture, that's the ed finance timeline at the state level. So that wraps up the overview, and we'll move into education expenditures unless there's no questions.
I have a question.
Yeah,
If I can. So when taxpayers pay that, pay their education taxes, they get a bill in the mail, and in our town, it's a combined tax rate, municipal and school, it all at once, and they pay it all to the town clerk. How does that money get to the state?
It's a great question, and it depends on the town, but essentially the Agency of Education is managing all of the cash flow. So all of the dollars that
The Agency of Ed does that, not the tax department?
the Agency of Education works in conjunction with the tax department. So Brad James of the Agency of Ed is figuring out the most efficient way for dollars to flow from towns to the tax department, back to school districts.
Okay.
But the combined rate of the municipal taxes and the statewide education taxes, this is a really helpful nuance. While it's a combined rate for ease of the taxpayer, the statewide education rate are state funds. So they're paying that to the statewide education fund. It's the cash flow that varies based on the school district. Does that answer your question?
So somehow Brad James will tell the town whether they can keep that money or send it into Montpelier if it's too much. Is that right? This may be something we don't need to know, Madam Chair. I don't know.
We can certainly get further into it. I think the way I think about it that helps me conceptualize it is that on some, and maybe this is not helpful for anyone else, but on some level, the towns are sort of holding that tax almost like a trust tax, the way a business holds a sales tax and then remits it to the state. It's just sometimes it's more convenient for it not to be remitted to the state, but it is sort of, they're holding the ed fund in trust, the ed fund money in trust on behalf of the state ed fund. It's just sometimes it goes somewhere and sometimes it doesn't. But wherever it goes, it's still ed fund money.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Is everyone over on the education committee?
Any questions here at this point? Great, we're fine, thanks.
Okay, thanks. And I think I can see your body language well enough that if folks put their hand up, I'll be able to tell. Thanks.
Great, then moving into education expenditures, on slide 7 now. Before we get into education expenditures, it's helpful to keep in mind that nuance that we talked about in the beginning, where the total level of expenditures ultimately determines the amount of revenues that need to be raised. So this is very different than the general fund and other state funds because at the local level, the total expenditures are being determined. And then the revenues need to be raised in order to fund those expenditures. So thinking about expenditures here on slide 7, we're first going to look at the local level. So as I mentioned, each school district builds an annual budget, which then needs to be approved by local voters in that district. And it's helpful, I think, to think of sort of 2 buckets within these local budgets. And I do want to mention all these slides are summary slides, so they have been simplified. I would be happy to talk offline about some of the more complexities, but I think it's really helpful to think in sort of these 2 primary parts of local budgets. So first we have offsetting revenues, which we see on the left side of the screen. And that includes things like state and federal categorical aid. So that's categorical aid, you'll think of special education, transportation, tuition revenues that are paid to that school district, prior year surpluses or deficits of that school district, and reserve funds of the school district. And so after thinking of all of the offsetting revenues in the local school budget, everything else essentially is education spending. So we've got the school budget, we take off all of those offsetting revenues and all of the remaining funds of the school budget, we can think of as education spending. So the funds the school district decides to spend net of the offsetting revenues it receives. This is a really important, education spending is a really important term in terms of education financing, because this is one of those 3 factors that determines the locally adjusted property tax rates. So we'll hear education spending come up again. And so moving on to slide 8, then if we think of education expenditures at a state level, we look at the education fund, and the education fund expenditures are the statewide aggregated costs in public education.
Can we interrupt for just a second? We have one question over here from Representative Austin.
Yep. I'm just wondering, in like 2 or 3 sentences, how is the state and federal categorical aid determined?
It depends on the categorical aid, and if we go to slide 9, we can just look at some examples of categorical aid, and we can see how the dollars in categorical aid really vary depending on the level. So you see special education, state-placed students, transportation, technical ed, and it's really determined by a variety of different funding formulas or allocation formulas.
Thank you.
Julia, how are the reserve funds considered? They're considered as revenue, but if they're a reserve, how, is there some percentage of them considered revenue, or is the entire reserve considered revenue?
Those are the reserve funds. I believe that you're on slide 7, you're talking about the
Yeah.
local school budget. Yeah, so the reserve funds, those are funds that the school district is deciding to put towards funding their budget.
Okay, all right, so it's not, if they have money that they've got excess and they haven't decided to spend it all, it's the chunk of a reserve that they decide to use to fund their school budget.
Yes.
Correct, okay, great, thank you.
Can you give us some examples of what those reserve funds would be? A brownie sale?
It's a great question. I'm not sure. I would have to get back to you on that.
The local reserve funds.
Could be anything. Not the state reserve.
Right.
Money that's being set aside for construction.
Yeah. Vehicles.
And we could get when Brad James comes in, or when we have someone coming in to talk about ESSER, both of them could sort of give more details of how schools do their individual spending in the reserve. Gilbert Campbell, assistant professor.
Yeah, I really do focus sort of at the statewide level. So often questions about specific school district budgeting processes. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm still getting up to speed on that. And also the Agency of Ed generally focuses on that more than I do. But do we have any other questions about local level expenditures? Okay. So back to the state level expenditures, I'm on slide 8 here. And once again, I think it's helpful to think of education expenditures sort of in 2 buckets. So we have the education payment, and this is the aggregated amount of all school districts' education spending. And then we have all other expenditures. So once again, we're thinking about categorical aid. Then because we're at the state level, we're thinking about one-time appropriations and other operating and administrative costs at the state level. So moving back to slide 9, which I know we sort of skipped ahead here, because it's, I think, helpful to look at just actual numbers and the way that these things shake out. So slide 9 is a screenshot of the December 1st Education Fund Outlook. I do believe that later in the morning, I'll be walking through the Ed Fund Outlook in more detail. But this is helpful to just see here some appropriations that are listed in the Education Fund Outlook. And you'll see that the Ed payment, which is in line 10, is generally about 80% of all appropriations in the Education Fund. So once again, sort of the conversation around education spending comes back to this being such a large portion of appropriations in the Ed Fund. We also see those categorical aid lines of special ed, state placed students, transportation ed laid out here. So that wraps up the my prepared remarks on education expenditures in the state. And unless there's no other questions, we can move on to education funding.
I think we're ready to move forward. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm on slide 11 now, and here we're looking at education fund sources in 2022. So Vermont pays for education through the Ed Fund, and the Ed Fund has sort of, once again, thinking about these 2 buckets. Now we're thinking of the 2 buckets of funding. So we've got the property tax sources, which are those blocks of green in this chart, and the non-property tax sources. So non-property tax sources include things like the sales and use tax, a portion of the meals and rooms, a portion of the purchase and use, a lottery transfer. And those revenue figures come from the state economist forecast. So we're not, unless the sales and use tax rate or those other rates are going to be adjusted, when we talk about adjusting tax rates in the education fund, usually we're talking about adjusting those property tax rates. So slide 12 is another screenshot from the Ed Fund Outlook, where we just see those revenue sources listed out here. And we see the property taxes, which is really what we're going to be getting into here, in lines 1A, 1B, and 2. So lines 1A and 2, those are the homestead education property tax, and then the non-homestead education property tax. And 1B, that's the property tax credit. So that's that income sensitivity portion to the homestead property tax. So I'm on slide 13 now and getting into property taxes. So as I've mentioned, education tax rates are set to keep the ed fund balanced, and the amount to raise statewide education property, the amount to be raised by statewide education property tax is determined by subtracting those non-property tax revenues, so the sales and use, the portion of the meals and rooms, from the total uses. And this gets back to, setting the property taxes to make sure that all expenditures are funded. So there's 2 property tax bases subject to the statewide education tax, and those rates differ by the base. There's the non-homestead property and the homestead property tax. And I pulled out a statute, just a simplified definition of homestead property, but essentially we can think of homestead property as just being where someone's principal dwelling is and the surrounding land around that principal dwelling. Slide 14 here, thinking about the non-homestead property tax. So this is a tax on all taxable real property that doesn't qualify as homestead and is not exempt. And I went to pull in a list of exemptions, and the list is so long that I would encourage you to just go to the citation if you're interested in seeing those exemptions. So the non-homestead property tax rate, when equalized, is uniform across all towns. And it's important to keep in mind that term equalized. I believe we'll be getting into, I don't think today, but maybe later in the week, discussions about the common level of appraisal. And essentially we can just sort of keep that in mind, that the common level of appraisal is used to adjust tax rates across towns based on different ways that the values of those properties in those towns have been appraised. So I'm talking about equalized, I'm talking about after all of those districts and towns properties have been equalized, so we can look at them as being sort of the same in terms of our analysis, the non-homestead property tax rate is uniform.
I've often thought in the back of my mind that the CLA was a little nutty. Maybe other people do. I mean, it looks at appraisals within a town, within a municipality, school district or whatever. But that doesn't satisfy me that a house like mine in Thetford is appraised similarly to a similar house 2 towns away. And I don't see that we really resolve that issue. And if you can enlighten us.
Representative Meslin, we are going to go deep on the CLA.
Go later.
Later this week.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I just want to check my understanding here, because I've heard from a number of constituents on the issue of the sort of difference between non-homestead and homestead, and that, it seems like usually the non-homestead rate is higher than the homestead rate, but in some cases the homestead rate is higher, and that usually has to do with either the CLA being maybe out of date for that community, or higher than kind of average per pupil spending in that community. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. So the way that a homestead rate would be greater than the non-homestead rate would be really that relationship between the district's per pupil education spending and the statewide per pupil education spending and the yield that's set by the General Assembly. The CLA that's applied to the tax rates is the same CLA is applied to the non-homestead property tax rate and the homestead property tax rate. So it's really looking at that relationship of per pupil education spending and the statewide per pupil education spending and the yields that have been set and the non-homestead rate that's been set.
Everyone over in the education committee? Good.
Yeah, I think we may have one.
I do feel that my town of Woodstock representative bus is one of those communities where the non-homestead is much lower than the homestead. And I've had a lot of constituents complain about that. And so I don't know how to go back and explain to them what you just explained to me. And because that means I'd have to dive into that school's budget in order to get their per pupil spending, correct?
Yes, so I think that maybe a helpful way to think about this big picture, and I would also be happy to sit down offline and think about what's happening specifically in your community. But thinking really big picture, talking to a constituent, it gets back to the relationship of that district's spending decisions and statewide spending decisions, as well as the legislature's decisions with respect to the setting of the non-homestead rate and the homestead property yield. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
And I would definitely recommend taking Julia up on her offer to take an individual look at it.
Thank you.
We're set. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And these are all really, I think, excellent questions because they really get to the nuance of these relationship and tensions between different communities, the non-homestead and the homestead rate, and the intricacies of how all of that plays out. So moving on from non-homestead to the homestead property tax, I'm on slide 15 now. So once again, this is a tax on all real property that qualifies as homestead. And the homestead property tax rate in each town is dependent on its locally approved education spending per pupil. So we're seeing that term education spending again. And it's important to note that it's that locally approved education spending per pupil that we're really thinking about. So moving on to slide 16 here, getting into the homestead property tax. And right now we're really looking at the property tax. We haven't started to think about the introduction of that income sensitivity. So we're just going to start off thinking about the homestead property tax. So by statute, the tax rate is $1 for homestead property. And this effectively creates a floor. So school districts can't have a homestead property tax rate below $1, but they can have a homestead property tax rate above $1. So after voters approve that school budget, the homestead property tax rate is adjusted by the ed spending per equalized pupil. And if a town belongs to more than one district, that homestead tax rate is going to be prorated based on their enrollment in each district. And so I think an equation, so I think this was a helpful way for me to sort of think about how the property tax rates are adjusted, but just to walk through what we're seeing here in this equation. So the spending adjusted equalized property tax rate equals that dollar base multiplied by this adjustment factor that we see in the right-hand side of the equation. So in the numerator, the top part of that fraction, we see the education spending per equalized pupil. And education spending per equalized pupil is what it sounds like. It's the education spending of the district that I know I keep hammering on, divided by the equalized pupils. And the next slide will get into exactly what are equalized pupils, but we can think about that as being sort of the adjusted pupils in that district. So in the numerator, we've got the ed spending per equalized pupils. In the denominator, the bottom part of the fraction, we have the property yield. And that is the statewide property yield that is set by the General Assembly, and usually that bill starts here in Ways and Means.
Quick question. So the CLA will never adjust the local property, homestead property rate below 1?
It may.
Oh,
So this is the equalized property tax rate. So that's a really helpful nuance. So that equalized property tax rate is talking about when we, for instance, when I come in here, maybe later on, and you're interested in seeing what's happening in different school districts, we'll be looking at the equalized rate in all of those different school districts, because that's a way that we can compare across communities. The CLA is then later used by the tax department when sending out those bills to adjust by each town.
Okay.
So, I was on the committee before, but I left right at the time when the yield came into being. So I've never really felt like I understood it very well. So this is probably a dumb question, but
No dumb question.
There's one yield, right? Statewide. Everybody uses the same yield. Is that correct?
Yes, and that is not, I think that, well, there's the one homestead property yield, and then there's also the income yield, but there's one statewide property yield. And we'll get more into later in the presentation, interpreting that property yield.
Okay.
And when the representatives say that there's two yields, that is correct. There's the one property yield, and then when we get into the income sensitivity portion, there's also an income yield.
I'll just listen then.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Sure. And when we get further to the,
There are really no dumb, I mean, that wasn't a dumb question, but there are really no dumb questions on this. It's incredibly complex and confusing with a lot of technical terms that mean very specific things. So I think Julia keeps on landing on this education spending. It's because spending on education spending are two totally different things, right? And so, yeah, it's incredibly confusing.
very confusing, and I'm very happy to say the same thing multiple times in different ways, because I started last year and it took me a while and a lot of long nights to get up to speed on education finance. So, and I would be happy to sit down again offline with anyone to go over any questions. Any other questions on that slide where we're looking at that preliminary equation? We'll get more into understanding equalized pupils and the property yield on the next two slides.
I think we're good.
Okay. So I'm on slide 17 now, thinking about pupil weights and equalized pupils. So for those of you who were in the legislature last year, there was the Act 127, the pupil weighting bill, that was colloquially called. So I know we've talked a lot about pupil weights, but to remind folks, pupil weights are used to adjust student counts to address different student needs or different student circumstances. And these are used, so after average daily membership is reported, and essentially average daily membership is just, a metric used to figure out, on average, how many kids are sitting in chairs in a school. So after average daily membership is reported, those weights are applied to certain types of students to account for potential higher costs to the school district to educate those students in those circumstances. So examples of pupil weights that were passed in Act 127, which will come into effect next year in FY25, those were things like grade level weights, students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, students in sparse districts, attending small schools, English language learners. And so those pupil weights are applied to the average daily membership. And then under current law, and this will only, assuming that Act 127 kicks in FY25, which it is currently supposed to do, this will only apply for the next year. But after those weights are applied to the pupil counts, the equalization ratio is then used to bring down uniformly across the state all of those weighted pupils down to the technical number of pupils that exist in the state. So districts will see their actual pupil count or their actual average daily membership differ from their equalized pupils, dependent on how many more or less weighted pupils they have in their district in comparison to the rest of the state.
Can I ask a quick question about that? So that is true in today's current, like right now?
Yes.
And it'll change how in 2025?
Yes,
Just
so in
different-
2025, there will be different weights and there will no longer be an equalization ratio. So in 2025, so the equalization ratio was another step in the process that mathematically didn't do anything. So that was pulled out. My understanding was with the intent to sort of simplify the ed funding formula. So people in FY 2025 next year, those pupil weights will be applied and then that will be it. So we'll be looking at weighted pupils where the count of weighted pupils is much higher than the actual number of pupils in the state.
And we'll spend some time on pupil weighting next week, I believe.
Okay. So there we have our equalized pupils, right? So now we've talked about the numerator, the top of the fraction. We've got the education spending divided by the equalized pupils, that's per pupil education spending. And now we can get back to interpreting the property yield. So I'm on slide 18 now. And we have just a reminder, that's the same equation that we saw in the previous slide, but just thinking about how all of these pieces fit in. So the property yield is a helpful way to think about it is sort of the per equalized pupil amount of spending that the fund could support with a uniform homestead tax rate of $1 on homestead value. And in districts that spend more per equalized pupil than the property yield, then those districts' homestead property tax is increased proportionately. And we can see that in the equation here, right? So we see the property yield, and the higher that property yield is, the higher the ed spending per equalized pupil of a district can be without increasing their property tax rate, right? So if a district is spending, if a district's ed spending per equalized pupil is the exact same as the property yield, they're not going to see any adjustment to their tax rate. And so I've included a few numbers here to help us interpret a property yield. So in FY22, the property yield was 11,317. So this means that districts that spend equal to that amount per equalized pupil or below that amount per equalized pupil would see an equalized tax rate of $1 before the introduction of the CLA. And then districts that spent above the yield, above that $11,317 per equalized pupil, would see an equalized tax rate greater than $1.
And we have a whole study exploring that dollar that's coming to us at some point, right?
I am not sure.
Okay, great.
We do have a study that will be published within the next week or so that's looking at the mechanics of setting the yields.
Okay.
To include a constitutionally adequate base amount, but as a constitutionally adequate base amount, sort of as a broad picture how a base amount could be included.
Thank you.
And then I've just included an example here. So say that you have a district that spent $16,975 per equalized pupil. That would be 150% of the yield. So they would see an equalized tax rate, homestead property tax rate of $1.50.
So if a district spent 10,000, their tax rate would be 1.
Correct.
So there's no encouragement to reduce student spending because you're paying $1 anyway.
So
Well, the property.
Below 11.
Can we all do the signaling and the taking turns?
Sorry.
Recognize it. No, thank you. Julia.
yeah, so there's no encouragement to spend below the property yield. Because if a district is spending below the property yield, in this example, below 11,317, they're still going to have that tax rate of $1. So that's when we can sort of think of it as effectively setting a floor, right? Technically, they can spend below that amount, but that district will still see the base amount of $1. They are incentivized, in theory, to spend lower, not below the yield, but the higher that the district spends, the higher their homestead adjusted property tax rate will be. There is also the excess spending threshold, which I don't get into here, but essentially the higher, once a district spends above a certain amount, 121% of the prior year's average, then they have additional tax liability introduced, but that has been suspended through FY 2029. First from the pupil weighting bill and then from Act 127.
And we have some questions from the other.
Thank you. The yield is also a function, and maybe you said this and I just missed it, but the yield is also a function of how much non-homestead property income comes into the education fund. In other words, if we have a ton of sales tax revenue, then the yield presumably goes up.
Yes, that is correct. And that's a really excellent point. So this gets back to the sort of the necessity of adjustment within the revenue sources, within the tax rates, dependent on all of these different factors. So it's certainly the yield is a function of the performance of the non-property taxes, as well as a function of the education expenditures.
Thank you. I wondered how many towns are spending at $1?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I could certainly get back to you.
I'd love to see the whole range.
And I think we're going to do sort of regular updates from the Agency of Education as budgets come in, as we're setting the yield, and that's something that we could include in that.
They are. I don't think anybody spends that.
Back to you, Julia.
Okay. So now we
are getting a little tighter on time, and this is very important. And so I just want to balance those two things.
Okay, I can certainly speed up. I'm in the final portion of the presentation where we look at income sensitivity. So I'm on slide 19 now and thinking about the property tax credit. So it's helpful to think about the property tax, Vermont funding as a homestead tax. Property tax has a credit based on income. Often we'll hear that it's some people pay on income, some people pay on property, and about 70% of Vermont households receive a property tax to their homestead. Receive a property tax credit to their homestead property tax based on their income. And this credit is applied to the following year's tax bills. And it's a credit that is limited by the taxpayer's income. So I've got a little table here that shows basically how this shakes out. But essentially for household income, so we can sort of think about that as the income of everyone in the household. There are some nuances there. But if the household income is less than or equal to $47,000, then the property tax credit may be used on the first $400,000 of the house site value. And also there's some additional tax relief that's available based on the household income. For household incomes up to $90,000, the property tax credit may be used on the first $400,000, as I just mentioned. And then for household incomes above $90,000, the property tax credit may be used on the first $225,000. And I included this 134,800 here to have a sense of, who will qualify for a property tax credit. And this varies from year to year. This isn't a number that's set in statute. It's really a mathematical exercise. At what point will a household break even and never qualify for a property tax credit? And in FY 22, that's 134,800.
Yeah.
Just a little question, I think probably has the answer, but the reason it's applied to the following year tax bill is just like a timing thing when we know people's income.
Exactly.
Spending and when bills are sent.
Exactly.
And that 70%, some of them might be receiving just $100, as opposed to some of them are getting their total amount might be credit.
Correct.
Okay.
Do you know what percentage of Vermont households pay their education tax exclusively based on income? It's not 70%, it's less, right?
Yes, I don't know the percentage. Okay, so I'm on slide 20 now, interpreting the income yield. This is looking really similar to what we were just looking at for the homestead property tax. And so the difference that I'd like to point out is that here the base is 2%. So in the homestead property tax, we saw the base was $1. Here the base is 2%. We see that adjustment factor at spending per equalized pupil divided by the income yield is very similar for the homestead property tax adjustment. The difference is the income yield. So that's the second yield. It's for the property tax adjustment. And the tax rate on income in any district is adjusted proportionately based on that district's spending decisions, just like the homestead property tax. And I've included a similar example to what we saw for the homestead property tax adjustment. I think I'll pass over that unless it would be helpful for me to go through it. Okay. So slide 21, this is outlining those further credits for incomes less than 47,000, often referred to as the circuit breaker. And about 30% of homesteads that are eligible for income sensitivity are also eligible for a homeowner rebate. And essentially, these households with incomes under 47,000 are entitled to additional tax relief if their net education tax exceeds a fixed percentage of their household income. So we see two tables on the bottom of the slide. On the left side, we see the net state education tax. And this is that tax cap as percentage of income for that state property tax, or sorry, state education tax. And this is a tax expenditure borne by the education fund. On the right side, we see the municipal property tax caps. And this is the cost of this municipal homeowner rebate is borne by the general fund. Okay. And then slide 22 is really just sort of summarizing this income sensitivity and thinking about, how much are people paying in homestead property tax. So we see on the left side of the table, the different delineations of household income. The house site value is in the next column. And then we see how we would calculate the amount that would be paid under income. Lastly, we see the calculation of the property tax credit in the far right column. So essentially the property tax credit is the amount that was paid for property taxes minus the amount essentially that would be paid based on income. And that wraps up my whirlwind tour of Vermont's Education Fund and education financing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bolio, just to set expectations really clearly early in the session, we're running a little bit behind on our agenda today. And so we are now transitioning very slightly into understanding the education outlook in the December 1st letter. And I think it'd be helpful if you, Julia, maybe take a breath if you need to, and then dive into the education outlook so that when Commissioner Bolio talks to us about the December 1st letter, we understand what he's talking about a little bit better.
Certainly.
Thank you.
So,
do you want some water?
I have my water bottle, but I'll take a sip.
Thank you.
So while I take a sip of water, there is the Ed Fund Outlook that's posted under my name, I believe on both committees' pages. Is this still a joint hearing?
Mm-hmm. And because all good rules have an exception, as yesterday's Sorcia said, we are rarely going to print anything. One of the few things that we do like to print out is the Education Fund Outlook. So it's on Ways and Means folks' desk.
Bless you.
Thank you.
All right. I also printed out a copy. So I know I alluded to this in my overview presentation, but the Education Fund Outlook, while not an operating statement, it's really used sort of as a tool by us at JFO, as well as within the legislature and the administration, to sort of keep track of all of the moving pieces in the education fund. So as we go through the session and things start happening that are impacting the education fund, we'll be updating the outlook to keep track of all of those moving pieces. So what I was thinking I would do here today is just sort of walk through the Ed Fund Outlook and how we can interpret these different lines and how we can read and understand the information that's being presented to us here. So
We're just having trouble accessing it. It says it's not posted.
Okay, we're just having a little trouble accessing,
go
but we'll
back?
get that figured out. We'll get it through the Ways and Means website if necessary. Thanks.
Yep, it is posted on our website if you want to
Yep.
travel over there.
All right, perfect, thanks.
It's there. Okay, back to you.
Okay, so big picture, looking at the Ed Fund Outlook here, we see 4 columns. The far left column, these are the descriptions of what each line is telling us. And then we've got the 3 columns on the right with the numbers in them. We've got the different years. So we see FY 2022, those are the actuals, FY 23, the projected, and then FY 24. And this is reflecting what was presented in the December 1st letter. So these first lines A through H, these are really summary lines. So we're seeing here the average homestead property tax rate, the average tax rate on household income, and then lines C, D, and E. Those are the most informative with respect to this committee and the yield bill, because those are telling you what is that uniform non-homestead property tax rate. In line C, line D, the property yield, and line E, the income yield. We also have some helpful metrics here. We've got the equalized pupil count, the statewide education spending growth, and the statewide education grand list growth. So for instance, just looking at these summary lines, if we wanted to know the property yield that was in FY22, we would go over and we would see, as we saw in the presentation, that was 11,317. The next chunk that we have here are the sources. So these are the revenues in the education fund. We looked at that screenshot earlier, but we see lines 1A and 1B. That's referring to the homestead property tax with that income sensitivity. And line 2, that's that non-homestead property tax. Then lines 3 through 8, those are the non-property tax revenue sources. So those are going to be updated actually this coming Tuesday with the emergency board when we get the economist's forecast. Line 9, that tells us our total sources, total amount of money that's coming into the education fund, with the exception of reversions, which we'll get to further down. The next chunk, which you also saw a screenshot of, appropriations. This is money that's flowing out of the education fund. So we see line 10, that education payment, that aggregated ed spending of all school districts. Then we see a line, a number of lines, categorical aid. So 11 through 17. We see the teachers' pensions, the new ongoing normal cost of teachers' OPEB. And then in line 20, we see the one-time appropriation for universal school meals in line 20. So line 22, that's telling us the total uses. The next lines 23 through 27, this is telling us sort of about the flow of dollars in the education fund. So at line 23, revenue surplus and deficit, that's our total sources minus our total uses. So line 9 minus line 22. And for those of us who haven't worked in accounting, it's helpful to remember that if there are parentheses, that means the number is negative. Line 24, those are prior year reversions. So that's money that's being reverted back to the ed fund. We see in FY22, the reversions were 11.7. And in FY23, the reversions were 45.5 million. Which was significantly higher than it has been in previous years. Then in line 25, we see a transfer to the stabilization reserve. And this is sort of, we're going to jump ahead into the next section, the stabilization reserve section, which is lines 28 through 31. You likely know there's a stabilization reserve of the education fund. So it's 5%. It's kept at 5% of prior year net appropriations. So in line 28, we see the prior year stabilization reserve. How much money was in the stabilization reserve at the close of the previous year? Then we see the current year stabilization reserve, how much money is in the reserve in line 29. A reminder that it's being kept at 5%. That's traditionally what it's being kept at. And then line 31 is saying, what is the reserve target? What amount of funds need to be in the stabilization reserve to have it be 5% of the prior year net appropriations? So going back up to these summary lines, we were in line 25, transferred to from stabilization reserve. We see that that's the reserve target, line 31 minus the prior year stabilization reserve, line 28. So 2.8 million went to fill that stabilization reserve up to 45 million. Line 26, that's a transfer to or from an additional reserve. So that's if money is transferred from, for instance, we had the additional reserve for other post-employment benefits a couple years ago. Last year, there was the transfer to the PCB reserve. So that's where that transfer is being captured. And lastly, line 27 is telling us, okay, how much is being transferred to unreserved and unallocated? How much is left over, or how much are we over spending? So that's our revenue surplus. So that's our line 23 minus 24, 25, and 26. And then we move into we can skip over the stabilization reserve section because we've already gone through that. Next, we get to the additional reserve section, and that's where those additional reserves are. So we see in FY22, there was that additional reserve of $14 million. 13.3 of that was used to pre-fund the normal cost of teachers' OPEB. We also see that there was a PCB reserve in FY23, and 2.5 million have been dispersed from the emergency board. By the emergency board. So in FY24, we see that PCB reserve is at 29.5 million. And then lastly, we see available funds here at the very bottom, lines 34 and lines 35. Line 34 shows us the prior year unreserved and unallocated. So we can see that in FY23, there was in line 35, current year unreserved, unallocated, $63.4 million. And then that flowed through to FY24. And so that's the prior year unreserved and unallocated. And finally, line 35, that's current year. How much is sitting on the bottom line that hasn't been spent? You can see here that it's 0.5 million. And the reason that it's 0.5 million, and I'm sure I can talk to this or Commissioner Bolio can talk to this, but statutorily in the solving for the December 1st letter, all funds here on the bottom line, the current year, unreserved, unallocated, statutorily need to be applied to lowering the average tax bill across all three classes. So there's more than 0.5 million that's available for the deliberation of the legislature, but for the purposes of solving the Ed Fund outlook, for the December 1st letter, those dollars had to be applied to the yields and the tax rate.
I think over on the Ed Committee, we have some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Austin.
Yep, and I probably should know this, that on line 14, the technical education aid, it looks like it swung considerably. I'm just wondering what the explanation for that is.
That is a great question, great point. So line 14, we see that in FY22 it was 17.2 million, and then in FY23 it was 30.5 million, and then in FY24 currently we're carrying 16.3. That includes a 15 million one-time appropriation that was made last session to VHCB for that one-time revolving loan program. So that includes both the categorical aid as well as the one-time appropriation from last session.
And that was the money to VHCB to pay for a new CTE program.
Right, in the building trades. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay,
And so I think with that, we're going to discuss the December 1st letter with the
I
commissioner.
believe so.
Thank you very much.
Yes. But I'll stay in the room in case there's any more questions for me.
Thank you.
Hello again.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And just a logistics alert for you. The Education Committee is joining us in the joint hearing. I am trying to be attentive to what's happening on their screen, but
So they're looking at my face, but I think they're looking at the back of my head.
yes, they cannot see the back of your head.
Okay, perfect. For the record.
I'll alert you if they have a question.
Sure.
Yes.
For the record, Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. I will say on days like this, I'm very thankful that we're just next door, coming over here. And thank you, Julia, for all of that overview. It's a very complicated system, as you all either know or are coming to learn. As the Tax Commissioner, certainly my expertise lies in the sources side of the Education Fund Outlook. I can try to speak with some intelligence to the appropriations side, but I often have to defer to my colleagues in the Agency of Education. If you ask me something really tough, I might also fund it to Julia. But the December 1st letter is a letter that the Tax Commissioner publishes every year. It'd be helpful if I got my notes so I could talk to you guys. It's mandated in statute that the Tax Commissioner has to publish every year. It's called the Tax Education Rate Letter, but we all call it the December 1st letter because it's due on December 1st of each year. And the purpose of the letter is to help inform Vermonters and stakeholders like the legislature, like school districts, about what the landscape for statewide property taxes might look like. It is a complicated mathematical exercise that is done not solely by my department, but in partnership with a lot of really smart people from the Agency of Education, the Joint Fiscal Office, Department of Finance and Management, and the Agency of Administration, working with the talented analysts that we have at Tax to do really meticulous work on a really tight timeline. And so I'm really appreciative of everybody coming together, collaborating and doing that, doing a really good job every year. The calculation is laid out in statute. There are a few key points to it, and essentially it's a big exercise to take all of the projected sources, the non-property tax revenues, as Julia had outlined, and all of the projected uses for the subsequent fiscal year, and also determine what we believe the grand list tax base looks like, and then solve for how much money we would have to raise in property taxes, and combined with the tax base, what that means for rates. And we're using the best information that we have available at the time. So things can obviously change after the letter is published.
What I hear you saying is that on some level, this is more of a math exercise than a policy exercise on your department's behalf. Is that, how would you characterize it?
I think there's two elements to it. One is strictly a math exercise, right? That's laid out in statute about how we have to calculate the projection. But the administration also likes to use it. And there are notes in my letter about the point of view of the administration based on the math and suggestions about how they're hoping that the legislature might make decisions in response to that math. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Two key facts that are laid out in statute for the math that I like to point out. The first is that, as Julia had just mentioned, any surplus in the education fund must be used in the exercise to lower the rates. And we are also required to construct the forecast so that the homestead property taxpayers, both those paying on property and income and non-homestead rates, all have an average bill increase or decrease of the same percentage. So if homestead property taxpayers will see an increase of 4%, non-homestead taxpayers should see an increase of 4%, as should those who pay based on income. So that's the background of the letter. What the December 1st letter is saying this year is that if the yields and rates that are projected with the information that we had available at the time of publishing the letter become law, the average bill would go up almost 4%. And that is including a really significant surplus of $63 million, which I think I would be calling unprecedented if not for last year's unprecedented 90 million plus surplus. And one of the key points that I want to make is that particularly the last 2 years have been very unusual on this front. We do not see 63, $90 million surpluses, right? Usually we see 10 to 20. If we see 20 to 30, we're happy, right? So that's the first really interesting piece of this. And although the statute requires that we use that for the forecasting purposes, certainly the decision of what to do with the surplus is left up to the legislature. The second key element on the letter that I would point out is when you look at the equalized tax rate projection, it looks like good news because the average equalized homestead rate is dropping. But the other piece of that equation that's really key is what's called the common level of appraisal, which is a mathematical exercise to try to ensure equal property values around the state. And because so many communities around Vermont are seeing substantial increases in fair market value of property, the common level of appraisal in the vast majority of communities around Vermont is decreasing significantly. And that is the denominator in the actual tax rate that taxpayers will pay. So while the average equalized rate might be going down, the CLAs getting pushed down so significantly are one of the elements of creating, sorry, I'm twisting my words, is one of the elements of the equation that's leading to the actual bills being higher, despite the average equalized rates looking like they're decreasing. And the third big piece that really stuck out to me this year is the projected spending for education. It was 8.5%, which would be the largest in at least a decade, probably longer, and really goes to show that the inflationary pressures that are getting felt all around our economy, schools are not immune to them, right? And so they're experiencing the same kind of pressures, but that puts real rate pressure on taxpayers as well. If the surplus is not used to buy down rates, we would be looking at, or we were projecting in December, an 8% average increase in bills, which would be a large increase. I do know, I suspect the CLA is a really hot topic in here right now. And so I think.
We're having a conversation tomorrow, and then we're going to spend more time next week.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we have sort of a presentation put together to walk through all of that and what we're seeing around the state, which is that really everyone essentially is seeing the same impact, which is sort of interesting because if everyone's seeing it, it's almost not changing anything for anybody. It just feels like it is, but they'll be able to jump into more detail for that. I'm happy to pause there, Madam Chair, or I was going to talk about sort of why there's a surplus. It's useful to keep moving.
I think we're okay.
Okay, so there's a few elements to the $63 million surplus, and I must admit there's one of them that is a large one that I can speak with some intelligence about, and again, may have to ask folks to bring the Agency of Education into the conversation as well. But so to start, back in the July Ed Fund Outlook, there was a known $17 million surplus at the time. So when we were writing the letter in December, we knew about that going into it. Here's what changed between July and December. So the first element is that property tax credits cost less than anticipated. So people's incomes were higher than forecast. And that tracks with our forecast in personal income tax being lower than actual revenues coming in. So that makes sense. But that was a $6 million difference. So that increased the surplus $6 million. We also have a much higher amount of reversions than we normally have. So amounts appropriated to the education fund that were not ultimately spent. And that number is typically between 10 and 15 million, but was 45 million this year. So that was a substantial difference. And a big chunk of that is 27 million reversion in special education. And my understanding of that is twofold, that one, actual special education costs came in for districts less than they had projected. And two, that the state had appropriated an amount of money to hold back to make sure that we had enough money to pay off the tail of moving from the reimbursement model for special education to the census block grant model. And so it's a larger than usual reversion on that front.
We talked to Commissioner Gresham about that a little bit
Okay.
yesterday, and I imagine we're going to talk to Secretary French.
Perfect, yeah.
It's quite confusing.
Yeah, just briefly, Commissioner, thank you.
Sure.
You explained the tail yesterday, briefly in here. With regards to special ed money that I guess we could say wasn't used or wasn't required, have you had any complaints from school districts that they weren't getting the money that they expected and or needed?
No, I guess I would also say I'm not sure those complaints would come to my department.
I understand it's probably.
We would have a real problem if they did, so I'm happy to say I haven't gotten any.
I'll ask the question to the appropriate party, but it's reassuring if it's wasn't that schools and kids weren't getting the resources that needed, you know. But
Yeah, I would defer to the Agency of Education on that.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just anecdotally, my understanding from my colleagues in schools is that while they had the money, they didn't have the personnel and consequently didn't spend it.
So we can
I mean,
dive into that Secretary French and James.
Educated anytime.
And I imagine the Education Committee might spend some time on special education as well. Okay, thank you.
And the last piece that I would touch on in the letter is just what the governor is hoping the legislature will choose to do with the money, and that is to apply the surplus to reducing rates. Even with the application of the surplus, it's still a 4% average bill increase for property taxpayers around the state. So we have the luxury of a substantial surplus. It's definitely a better position to be in than the opposite. But the governor is hoping that the legislature will work to apply that surplus to reducing the rates for fiscal year 24.
Thank you. Any further questions for Commissioner Beaulieu? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Good. And with that, we are taking a 15-minute break, and I'll see you in